Michael Oshlink here, and today we're trying something new. I usually don't dabble into politics, but we live in very interesting times, and I think it's really important to have this conversation I'm about to have with Shahid Buttar. He is running in the 12th Congressional District against Nancy Pelosi. I say this is an important conversation for two reasons. One, I have a lot of respect for Shahid. I've known his work for many, many years, and we'll get into that in a moment. And this is an important time in our country's life, and I think we need new leadership, new thinking on a whole host of issues. And unfortunately, Mrs. Pelosi represents what I would call the past, kind of an industrial mindset, command and control, thinking that no longer serves us if it ever did. And we'll kind of get into that in a little while. So first, let me thank Shahid for being here in this conversation. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Michael. Thanks so much for having me.
Certainly. It's great to see you. So you've chosen an interesting person to run against, probably the most powerful Democrat in this country at this time.
Hardest target in the House.
So why don't we, before we kind of jump into the politics of it and the stances you are taking, and hopefully will represent to your constituents in the House when you win, tell us a little bit about your background and what eventually led you to the decision to run.
Thanks, Michael.
Yep.
I'm an immigrant constitutional lawyer, and I was studying law at Stanford when the Patriot Act was passed and when the Bush versus Gore decision, and I witnessed a whole set of events, including an invasion of another country. I got very engaged in the peace movement. Later, I've worked on marriage equality cases, I've worked on immigrant rights, I've worked on trying to stop mass surveillance to defend the privacy and freedom of expression of Americans. I've worked on military detention and torture issues, police accountability issues, and between those and money in politics, and between that spectrum of different concerns that I've had a chance to engage as a lawyer and as an artist and as an organizer and a nonprofit leader, it's really helped me see many of the various ways in which, unfortunately, our system is broken. And, between being a constitutional lawyer, being myself a working class public interest advocate, especially in America's most expensive city, it's been hard, quite frankly, not to witness many of the challenges that Americans are facing across our various stripes and across our various political ideologies. And that's it's that intersection of awareness and those various crises and the way our system is broken that's really driving me to run for Congress.
Excellent. Well, the crisis you talk about has been around for a while. It seems to be exaggerated now, unfortunately, but it's a bipartisan consensus that has led to a lot of the problems that we now face. You've mentioned a couple. There's surveillance state, as an example. Unending wars. Quite a few of them are questionable whether they're even constitutional, because there's been no congressional debate. Questions around transparency, police powers, all the things you've already mentioned. So we are hopefully exiting in the near future from this bipartisan consensus, because we'll have people like you on the left who are challenging the Democratic establishment. We have folks on the right, the more libertarian Republicans, who challenge the Republican establishment. So I see this kind of as hopeful, as a transpartisan flow to create new systems of thought, new infrastructures, new ways of organizing, new ways of thinking about our future. And some of the things that I know that are interesting to you that you've mentioned already are issues around the surveillance state.
Yeah.
So talk about how you are different than former Speaker Pelosi on those issues, for instance.
Yeah. Nancy Pelosi has been very much a defender of the Washington establishment, the bipartisan Washington establishment, which includes intelligence agencies. In early 2018, when the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Section 702, was up for expiration, this was the law that basically authorizes the internet-facing dragnet that the NSA set up originally without any statutory authorization and in clear violation of the First and Fourth Amendments. This is the dragnet that Edward Snowden revealed in 2013. That program was up for expiration at the end, actually, of 2017, and in early 2018, Nancy Pelosi took action to throw a wet blanket on reforms that would have imposed a judicial warrant requirement to constrain domestic NSA, FBI, and DEA searches. And I should be clear here, no one's position can't do any surveillance to keep the country safe. The contention is that it should be subject to judicial review, as the Fourth Amendment requires, specific to the time, place, and person. And what she basically ended up preventing was exactly that kind of reform, and allowing the agencies to continue in mass, in secret, without ever having to prove the legitimacy or justification, monitoring Americans to a greater extent than any people have ever been watched in the history of our species. And that offends me. You know, I grew up during the Cold War, and the reason that President Reagan used to deride the Warsaw Pact countries as an evil empire, it wasn't about their economic system, it was the fact that they spied on their own people. Way less than the United States does today. And Nancy Pelosi's complicity in not only extending for 6 years the mass surveillance powers available to federal intelligence agencies, but also expanding the range of surveillance beyond this prior baseline and giving those powers to the Trump administration, that was too much for me to watch from the sidelines. If that's how it's going to be, I needed to throw myself on the tracks for this.
So if you had been a member of Congress, then you would have supported like the Lofgren-Massey effort, as an example, in 702.
Yeah, and in fact, as an activist and organizer and advocate around these issues without a seat in Congress, I've been promoting the Massey-Lofgren Amendment for years. This was a transpartisan consensus to protect the integrity of encryption devices and standards, and also close the back search loophole that effectively allows domestic surveillance through so-called incidental collection that is entirely intended by the agencies exploiting a legal loophole that Congress has yet to fix. Not only would I, as a member of Congress, vote for those kinds of reforms, but I would perform the kind of oversight that no one has even attempted in arguably 2 generations. The last time Congress ever investigated federal intelligence agencies was in the late 1970s.
Right.
That is insane. You know, the Senate and the House Intelligence Committees were born from an investigation of domestic intelligence that revealed that the CIA, the FBI, even the Defense Department were engaged in wholesale abuses of First Amendment rights. And that's the kind of abuse that we can predict. That's the kind of abuse that we think is already happening behind the walls. You can see that without the transparency that Congress once insisted upon and has since abandoned, we really need members of Congress not only to legislate thoughtfully, but also to take seriously the oversight process. And I dare say, you know, there may have been members of Congress in the past who have entered the body as prepared as I am to conduct oversight, but there have not been many. And, you know, I've been doing this job long before I sought a seat in the body. And yes, absolutely, those are exactly the kinds of reforms that I would seek to insist on.
Nice. You mentioned HPSI, you know, the committee that's responsible for oversight of the intelligence agencies,
Right.
being created in the 70s as a result of the overreach of various domestic intelligence. Actually, let me rephrase that. Domestic law enforcement and foreign intelligence, CIA, is not supposed to operate domestically, and the Department of Defense. Overreach in terms of their powers, clear violation of the Constitution. That's why these committees were created in the first place, to provide oversight. When do you think they are captured by the same entities that they're supposed to provide oversight over and ensure that they operate constitutionally?
Right. Yeah, exactly when it happened is hard to say. I certainly can say that we haven't seen independence from Congress recently. Some part of this relates to the fact that the agencies have the information that members of Congress are trying to seek. And so as a member of Congress trying to conduct oversight, a big part of the project is finding allies and trusted sources within the agencies who can give you access to the information that might not be available through the newspaper. In that process, the creation and the cultivation of those relationships can compromise the independence that members need. So one of the crucial reforms here, with respect to enabling structurally more emboldening Congress, to make sure that congressional staff can be hired who have security clearance. At the moment, security clearance is what keeps a lot of members of Congress from being able to inform and bring their staffs into these questions about oversight. And that's a structural problem if the agencies levers that they shouldn't have. It's also interesting to think about agencies lobbying members of Congress using taxpayer dollars. I mean, I think there's a real need here to close down the loophole that allows agencies to use taxpayer dollars to then pay lobbyists to then lobby on the agency's behalf. Agencies have no business proactively lobbying members of Congress. If a member of Congress wants to ask someone from an agency what is happening here, that's one thing. But the idea that the NSA and the CIA and the FBI can flood Capitol Hill with lawyers to do a full court press and spinning facts and, quite frankly, misleading members of Congress, that is yet another source of corruption. Just like the military-industrial complex kind of corruption that President Eisenhower warned us about, he so clearly demonstrated in the phenomenon of mass NSA surveillance or local militarized police, which I think of as two sides of the same military-industrially corrupt coin. Constitutionally offensive corrupt coin. And maybe just one thing I'd say beyond that, when we talk about the COINTELPRO era, when the FBI was infiltrating peace groups and disrupting and neutralizing, in the FBI's words, the civil rights movement, it wasn't just overreach, and it wasn't even just violation. We are talking about a direct frontal assault on democracy by the agencies that we pay our taxes to keep us safe. President Eisenhower warned us it would happen. It should surprise no one, and we not only are back in that era where the agencies are unconstrained and unwatched, but they have more powers, including computers, which they didn't have then, than they ever have before. And the degree of state omniscience that we have stumbled into with nary a peep from Congress is unprecedented in our species' history. And the fact that members of Congress are so ignorant of the issues that they legislate over, I think, is just another reason why we so badly need generational change in Washington.
You mentioned the military-industrial complex, and from a more libertarian perspective, there are very few functions of the federal government that are acknowledged in the Constitution. Defense is one of them. So let me ask you a little bit about your perspective on the Pentagon and all the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, billions, excuse me, I wish it was millions of dollars spent at the Department of Defense. We know that we are now spending a lot more than we did at any other time when we're at war. Now, we still have wars going on, but they're not wars like we were fighting in Iraq, in Afghanistan back in the day. And it's kind of sad to say back in the day, which wasn't too long ago, or during the Vietnam War, or the Second World War, or the Korean War. But the amount of money we're spending is quite high. Can you speak to the amount of money we're spending specifically, and then also talk about any particular programs that are concerning to you? Like, for instance, one of the programs that I look at with a concerning eye as a taxpayer and as an advocate is like the F-35.
We are on the same train. Yeah, I have grave concerns about our foreign policy and Defense Department's use of its very robust allocation from the federal budget. And I want to be clear here, I am a strong fan of a robust foreign policy. I'm a assertive advocate for a smart foreign policy as opposed to a dumb foreign policy, and a foreign policy that relies on military strength first instead of diplomatic strength, instead of economic strength, a foreign policy that uses the military like an instrumentality instead of actually as an arm of defense is a dumb foreign policy, period. But in the service of a smart foreign policy, I would like to see us make sure that our military is actually prepared and ready to meet the threats of the 21st century. You talked about the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. It's a great example of not just a military boondoggle, but a waste of taxpayer resources with grave and horrifying consequences. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter over the next 50 years is going to cost $1.5 trillion. And it's worth pausing here to just try to get one's head around it. I think it's actually unfathomable for the human mind to conceptualize $1 trillion of anything, but we're talking about 1 million millions. And then half that again of scarce taxpayer dollars for a plane, let's be clear, that has been described as the object of procurement malpractice by senior Navy officials, a plane that can't actually address any of our actual national security threats. We have several. Culture and election hacking maybe is one of them. You can't fight that with a fighter plane. The Pentagon has long recognized that climate change is a national security threat. For a whole bunch of rising seas will flood Navy bases, they will instigate resource wars, and stop climate change with a fighter plane. In simulations, test pilots have said that the F-35 would fail in a dogfight relative to mid-20th century Soviet fighters, which is to say we're spending $1.5 trillion on a plane that can't meet its needs. And it's not as if to say that that's just $1.5 trillion that isn't coming from someplace that needs it. I live in San Francisco. Every day, I walk by a veteran sleeping on a cardboard box outside, often, in the rain and the cold. It is unconscionable that the Defense Department squanders $1.5 trillion of your dollars on a boondoggle, a corporate boondoggle that Lockheed Martin are sending, executives at Lockheed Martin are able to send their kids to fancy ski vacations or whatever, while they're sleeping on a box.
Right.
Anyone who claims to support our troops, I grew up in Missouri and I'm part of a military family. My brother served in the Army Medical Corps. I take very seriously the misappropriation of Pentagon funds and the corporate corruption visible in corporate contracts. Weapons that we don't need, consuming the resources that we do need to put a roof over every veteran's head, to make sure that every American can get to see a doctor, to make sure that college is affordable for everyone. We have the resources for these kinds of social programs. We just hurl them instead at corporate weapons manufacturers programs that don't actually advance a smart foreign policy. And I do think that the Defense Department's budget is an arena where we can find a vast sum of resources, at least $1.5 trillion over the next 50 years to fund a whole array of.
Yeah, and we'll put the discussion, debate, argument over social program spending aside. Completely agree with you, at least on the $1.5 trillion that we as taxpayers will be spending on the F-35, the boondoggle, which, you've already acknowledged, many inside the Pentagon already acknowledge is a problem. And a major problem. And even if you decided you didn't want to put the money into social programs, and I like the idea of helping veterans, of course, who are homeless and need a lot of help, get them off the street, get them the mental health they need, get them shelter, get them jobs, et cetera, et cetera. We're also doing
around the country of veterans. And that should really alarm anyone, especially people who claim to support our troops. These are people who've signed up, they've done their service. They've performed admirably, and we as a society have abandoned them.
Right.
And I'm not okay with that.
And I was going to get to the debt. So, a lot of folks on my side of the political spectrum would say, okay, let's not spend the $1.5 trillion on the F-35. Let's use it. If there are no programs we actually need within the Department of Defense that are useful for our own defense, then maybe we should use some of that money to pay down the debt. Now, we don't have to have that discussion at this moment, but what do you think about the $21 trillion debt we now have?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I would love to have the debate in Congress around what to do with this excess money that we managed to recover from fraudulent corporate contracts. And I think this is exactly what Congress should be debating. Yeah. Should we be reducing a deficit, or should we be spending on the dire needs that confront the American people? Personally, I am more interested, if we're able to go into debt to pay Lockheed Martin for fighter planes that we don't need, I would like to see us be willing to go into debt to make sure that Americans can see a doctor, make sure that veterans can have a roof over their head, and to make sure that students can go to college without having a $250,000 yoke around their neck when they graduate. In my mind, as a member of Congress, my job is to advance the rights of my constituents and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I think that across our partisan stripes, from the left to the right, we can agree on basic principles, and there will be disagreements. But a lot of the places where we will agree, I think that's where I particularly want to focus my energy in Congress organizing among my colleagues, not just within the Democratic Party, but particularly across the partisan aisle. There is an illusion that partisan gridlock and dysfunction has empowered Congress, when that's part of it, and I don't want to paper over that, but at the same time, much of what has disempowered Congress and made it a tool of an establishment that favors corporations for communities is its co-optation by corporate interests, and that is a bipartisan phenomenon. There's a whole range of issues where you can see a transpartisan consensus at the grassroots on policies that the parties in their institutional wings both reject. We've talked about a few of them in the context of civil liberties and Pentagon spending priorities. Another one that particularly jumps out at me is drug policy. The idea that cannabis is prohibited at the federal level, and it's the basis for a war on drugs that has destroyed the lives not only of individuals and not only of entire families, but we're talking about entire communities here. The creation of effectively a racial caste system in the United States on the backs of a prohibition that doesn't even respect the cognitive liberty principles that are embedded in the Constitution, right? We have a First Amendment for a reason. And I think that the war on drugs has never been constitutional in the first place. It's not been supported by a majority of Americans who want to end it, recognizing it as a failed example of institutional racism. And yet, find a Democrat or a Republican on Capitol Hill who is willing to say that this is an example of military-industrial corruption and to defend the rights of my constituents, I'm going to end the drug war. In California, we're lucky enough to have legal cannabis because our state legislature, in addition to many others, have recognized at least the basis for medicinal availability of cannabis, if not its recreational ability too. There's no philosophical basis for its prohibition federally, and we should be clear that the prohibition of cannabis has not only led to the rise of a militarized policing system that demonstrates racism every day, even if no one in the system is racist. The construction of the system itself is racist, especially when you think about differential penalties for different people who commit effectively similar offenses. This is an area where there is a transpartisan consensus among Americans that is opposed by a bipartisan consensus in Washington. And I am much more interested in, instead of the left-right division that has held back Congress from performing its function, to realign Congress around the center versus the periphery, which is to say people who are serving people in Congress, members of Congress who will serve people, Americans, instead of members of Congress who will serve power. I'm not seeking power. I'm seeking to represent my neighbors and Americans and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's why I'm running this.
You've covered a lot of great things, the surveillance state, the military-industrial complex, the war on drugs, specifically cannabis, but I have to imagine you're much more broad than that the whole war on drugs as a construct is the problem, not just cannabis particularly. One issue I'd like you to address is the indefinite detention. That as a provision, I think in the 2011 NDAA, there was an attempt by Congressman Amach to defeat it. Unfortunately, it was passed, signed into law. No one talks about it. It's shocking. Can you speak to it a little bit, just to inform our listening audience what it is and why they should be concerned about it, and then when you are a sitting member of Congress, what you're going to do to repeal it?
Thank you for raising it. I don't talk about it very often in public anymore because I'm afraid that someone in the executive branch will learn about it. And I think the only thing that protected us recently is the fact that it's so obscure. But there has been a provision in the federal law, working in the federal code since the beginning of 2012. In NDAA of 2011, which was passed at the end of the year, the Obama administration, to its credit, threatened not to sign, to veto the Defense Authorization Act over these two provisions, one of which is a permissive detention authority that says the military could detain Americans without trial or charge within the United States. The other one is a mandatory detention authority that would apply extraterritorially. But the point here is that law created the opportunity for Gitmo for the rest of us here in the United States, basically the legal basis for another Japanese internment. And to this point, no one had thought to use those powers. And I filed a legal brief. When I was running the Bill of Rights Defense Committee for 6 years, we filed a legal brief in I think it was the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, if I remember correctly, in 2013 probably. And the brief basically argued that if these powers are ever used, it's not as if federal courts are going to have a robust opportunity to intervene. The executive branch across context, in the surveillance context, in the detention context, in the torture context, in the policing context, routinely evades and circumvents judicial review. In the national security arena, usually by hiding the facts, right? People forget that just a few weeks before Edward Snowden revealed the mass surveillance dragnet to the world, the Supreme Court just a few weeks before had kicked out a case by Amnesty International challenging mass NSA surveillance, saying you can't prove that you've been spied on, so we're not going to listen to this case at all. And that same secrecy would insulate potential military detentions from judicial review. And that's why we filed a brief saying the judiciary, needs to step in now to strike this statute down on its face as unconstitutional, because you'll never get a chance to defend the constitutional principles that are implicated in practice as they are applied, because of this history of executive secrecy that we can predict repeating itself. There's a particular example involving a detainee who was tortured and kind of moved around by the Pentagon to evade the jurisdiction of different courts that were trying to make sure that he would have an opportunity for due process. And in fact, there's a conservative jurist who used to sit on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals who effectively wrote him himself out of a potential Supreme Court appointment, and then later resigned from the federal bench to go work, I think, for Boeing, if I recall correctly. And he was the judge who, conservative judge, Michael Ludig, I believe is his name. I'd have to check my notes to be sure. But he wrote the opinion saying, in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, the executive branch is trying to game the system. And he tried to stop it. And those are the kinds of attitudes we need among federal judges, and those are also the kinds of attitudes that we need among members of Congress. I am very willing to be a forethought, and I'm very willing to work with thoughtful members across the aisle of Justin Amash's work on the NDAA, as well as NSA, which I think is a model for it. And you've seen, when Representative Poe and Representative Blockman teamed up on the reforms that we mentioned earlier to close the backdoor search and protect the rights of Americans from the intelligence agencies that we pay to keep us safe. Another way to think of them is our domestic enemies of the Constitution that members of Congress and judges are supposed to be investigating and reining in. I'd be very eager to raise the importance of the right to trial, which is what the NDAA's detention powers undermine, is nothing less than the right to trial. And that is a fundamental right that has stood, let's be clear, for almost a millennium, right? I mean, we're talking about going back to the Magna Carta and hate corpus, and the idea that we are going to lose civilizational achievements, not just the international human rights that we fought a world war to defend, not just the warrant requirement that we fought a revolution to establish, but even the right to trial that was established in the 13th century, we are going to lose to rising authoritarian executive power. I am also not of that, and that's a big part of why I'm running, is to make sure that we can recover these rights and freedoms, that we can rein the executive branch back in, and that we can ensure constitutional rights for all Americans. That's a big part of my life.
From your lips to God's ears, maybe so. So we're in May of 2018. Walk us through what the primary, the general election. Give us a little bit of background on next steps and what's going on.
Sure, the process. So here in California, our primaries happen on June 5th, and it's a joint primary, which might be unfamiliar to a lot of your viewers, so I'll unpack this really quick. A lot of Americans are used to closed primaries, where voters can only vote for candidates in their party, and each party gets one nominee to go to the general election. An open primary is where any voter can vote for any candidate, regardless of party affiliation, but each party still gets one representative to go to the November election. In a jungle primary, any voter can vote for any candidate, and regardless of their party affiliations, just the top two advance to November. So parties are not guaranteed representation in the November election.
Wow.
Basically, the top two candidates in the primary go to an automatic runoff. So I'm in this moment in May, I'm fighting to be part of the November election by taking either first or second on June 5th. You noted at the outset of the program that Nancy Pelosi, the House Minority Leader, is the hardest target in the House, certainly among, if not the most well-funded. So I am confronting an institutional behemoth. I think it's not likely that I will take first in the June 5th primary, but I think it is. I'm quite confident that we're in a position to take second, and that will give me an opportunity to then challenge her for the seat representing California's 12th congressional district in November.
Nice.
This June's primary is a little different than a lot of June elections in San Francisco, particularly because there's a special mayoral election. Our last elected mayor passed away, unfortunately, in December, and so the election to select his successor will be on June 5th. And so the fact that there will be so many different mayoral candidates also driving people to the polls gives me some confidence that there will be at least participants in the process who've not been included before. And driving new voters to the polls is a big part of our strategy. With the campaign to capture this seat, we're trying not only to appeal to people, for instance, who might be concerned about the corporate domination of our federal policy apparatus, but also people concerned about their civil liberties, people who might be concerned about the drug war, people who might be concerned about the co-optation of tax dollars to fund corporate weapons contracts when there are homeless veterans all over San Francisco. Those are some of the people that we're trying to engage in this process, as well as people who supported the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders, and a whole range of other voices. But we have our work cut out for us over the next 4 weeks to drive people to the polls on June 5th. And I would encourage any of your viewers who want to introduce friends or neighbors in San Francisco to our campaign to visit us online at shahidforchange.us. We're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Shahid for Change, and very excited to offer San Franciscans an alternative to business as usual.
Well, you're a great alternative, and I hope to see you here in Washington, D.C. Next year, representing the 12th District in California.
Thank you, Michael. You're very kind. Thanks for having me on today.
You're welcome. Great to see you, and good luck to you.
I might need it. Thank you, brother.